Hey man, is there anything else I should know about Ronald Reagan? Oh, ho, 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 my friend, I am so very glad you asked. What wisdom would you like me to impart upon you today? Well, he can't be responsible for everything, can he? You know, I've heard a lot of people talk about how the war on drugs was supposedly Reagan's fault, but wasn't that a Nixon thing? Okay, technically, yes, the war on drugs was a Richard Nixon production, but keep it in your mind because we're going to come back to it in a minute. This shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone, but Ronald Reagan was profoundly racist and did tons of things to hurt non-white Americans during his time in office. And it all started with this lovely little scandal called the Iran-Contra affair. I temper my sense of decency and expectation. So essentially, it's the 1980s, the United States is still in the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and there's a whole lot of anti-communist sentiment going around, to the point where the United States is actually helping and funding various anti-communist groups all over the world. Specifically, this group down in South America called the Contras, who are actively trying to fight and overthrow the Cuban-backed Nicaraguan government. Now, it's also important to note that while the Contras were getting help and funding from the American government, specifically the CIA, the majority of their money came from the South American no-sugar trade. Now, meanwhile, over in Iran, there were about 7 or 8 American hostages that we were trying to negotiate the release of. Ronald Reagan came out publicly and did his whole "we don't negotiate with terrorists" bullshit, but in secret, he did in fact negotiate release of said hostages. Wait, but he got the hostages freed. Isn't that technically a good thing? It would be a good thing if that was where the story ended. Basically, in order to secure the release of these hostages, the United States had to give Iran roughly $30 million and a shit ton of weapons. But here's where things get fucky. Roughly only $12 million worth of that money actually went towards Iran. The rest of it went to the Contras. And by the way, this all was only discovered years later. I don't know how it wasn't the end of Ronald Reagan's political career, but here we are. Okay, so what does all that have to do with the war on drugs? Well, you see, after we gave all that money to the Contras, we decided to start helping them out with the drug trade. Now, you remember the whole "just say no" thing that was really big in the 80s and 90s? That was all the Reagan administration. They're the ones who perpetuated this belief that drug addiction was a personal choice, and they treated it like a legal issue rather than a health issue. And all sorts of social safety programs under Reagan were either gutted or removed completely. So there was no real support for people struggling with drug addiction, you know. There weren't any resources for them to try and get clean and get back on their feet. They essentially just got thrown the fuck in jail. I see. But what does that have to do with him being racist? Well, you remember how I told you about how the CIA decided to help out the Contras with the drug trade? A lot of that nose candy ended up here, and specifically it ended up in black and brown communities. And all of that ended up becoming the crack epidemic of the 1980s, and it just served to perpetuate more harmful stereotypes about non-white Americans. But why? What would be the purpose of flooding drugs into non-white communities? Well, think about it. What was a culturally significant milestone that black and brown communities had achieved pretty recently in the 1980s? Oh God, it was the civil rights movement, wasn't it? Bingo. Oh yeah, it's also important to note that he also closed a shit ton of mental institutions, both in California when he was governor and around the country when he became president, which led to a massive influx of mentally ill homeless people, many of whom either unalived or were also thrown the fuck in jail. Jesus fucking Christ, was there anything else he did against non-white Americans? Yes, he also perpetuated the myth of the welfare queen. This man got on his podium and took one legitimate story about welfare fraud and blew it way the fuck out of proportion. Specifically, there was this woman in Chicago named Linda Taylor who was a scam artist, and she took money from the government illegally. She was also tried and convicted. And do you want to know how much money they could actually prove that she defrauded the federal government for? $8,000. That doesn't sound like a whole lot, even by the standard of 1980s money. Yeah, that's because it wasn't. But Ronald Reagan said with his whole chest that this woman was making $150,000 a year off of welfare. So yeah, he's a liar on top of everything else. But now, to this day, you've got motherfuckers who legitimately believe that there are people out here living off of like $15,000 a month worth of food stamps because they don't understand how the welfare system works. And then you've got motherfuckers writing songs about how fat people shouldn't be able to eat fudge rounds. Good lord, did he do anything good during his time in politics? I mean, he did implement no-fault divorce when he was governor of California, so there's that, I guess. As for the rest, I think we can all agree he's in hell waiting for heaven to trickle down.